a midwife brought life until one delivery ended in death. Welcome to Midnight Radio Drama. I am your host, Wilfred. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Hearing from you makes this journey unforgettable. Let's begin. Flaxborough's town hall was not a building designed for grandeur. Its stone frontage, grimed by years of coal smoke and municipal apathy, possessed just enough ornament to suggest that when constructed in the late Victorian period, someone had feared a lack of crenellation might lead to accusations of parsimony. The council chamber itself, however, smelt less of heritage than of varnished wood, boiled cabbage, and the faint, medicinal sting of floor polish. It was into this aromatic setting that the annual meeting of the Women's Rural Benevolence League had been set. The League's members, dressed in an orderly spectrum of beige, dove grey, and charitable lilac, occupied the front rows in neat ranks of hats. Behind them, overflow seating, clustered a few townsfolk who had come less for benevolence than for spectacle. Mrs. Bloxby, the mayor's wife, sat at the head table, her expression carrying the weary tolerance of one accustomed to both speeches and sponge cake. She had agreed to present a silver-plated salver to Mrs. Agnes Threadgold, Flaxborough's most long-serving midwife, for distinguished service to the community. Agnes, a tall woman of 60-odd years whose face displayed neither pride nor false modesty, accepted the fuss with the same steady gaze she reserved for babies arriving at inconvenient hours. "Ladies," Mrs. Bloxby concluded, "we gather not only to honour Mrs. Threadgold's many years of service, but also to reaffirm our faith in those ordinary acts of care that hold a community together." Applause, polite and rustling, drifted across the chamber. It was at that moment, when all had been timed for the modest clatter of teacups to follow, that a sudden cry rose from the back. "Good Lord, someone fetch the police!" The voice belonged to Councillor Horace Pike, a florid man in his 60s, whose waistcoat buttons had long given up their intended duties. He had been attempting to steady himself against a chair, but now stood pointing a trembling hand toward a figure slumped at the side of the hall. The unfortunate person was Mr. Gerald Venables, secretary of the Flaxborough Horticultural Society, and known chiefly for his relentless advocacy of chrysanthemums. He lay half-tilted against the panelling, his head resting in a manner insufficiently dignified for the League's sense of occasion. Mrs. Threadgold, midwife instincts still brisk after decades, was first to reach him. Her movements were efficient, her face expressionless, as she bent to examine him. After a brief moment, she straightened and said flatly, "He's dead." This declaration travelled round the chamber with the efficiency of a gust through a chimney. Women clutched their handbags closer, men cleared throats as though polite coughing might restore dignity to the scene. "Dead?" repeated Councillor Pike, who had an actor's gift for unnecessary echo. "But, and we've only just had the sponge cake cut." 2 constables were summoned. The body was moved to the council anteroom, though not before the Women's Rural Benevolence League had engaged in urgent whisperings concerning propriety, fate, and whether the tea should still be poured. By the time Inspector Purbright arrived, a quiet man in a sober raincoat, his spectacles misted by the drizzle outside, the town's rumour machinery had already accelerated into a familiar rattle. Venables had been poisoned, stabbed, frightened to death, or merely overcome by an excess of beetroot wine. Each theory found its champion. Purbright, for his part, did not appear to favour any. He stood just inside the chamber, listening with polite patience to Mrs. Bloxby's breathless account. When she concluded with the assurance that Mrs. Threadgold was most professional indeed, he inclined his head gravely, as if the midwife's professionalism were the essential fact. At length, when the crowd's nervous chatter had dwindled, Purbright asked his only question of the evening. Had Mr. Venables, he said mildly, seemed at all uneasy before the meeting began? Nobody could quite agree. He had spoken rather less than usual, some thought. Others remembered him as perfectly himself, pompous, wheezy, faintly indignant about chrysanthemums. Only Mrs. Threadgold, still calm, remarked, "He looked as though something had caught at him. Inside. Something he hadn't meant to show." Purbright nodded once, very slightly, and said no more. He thanked Mrs. Blocksby, commended the constables for their briskness, and drifted toward the door with the quiet air of a man for whom death among chrysanthemums was an occurrence not shocking, merely curious. Outside, the drizzle continued to stitch the cobbles. Flaxborough, that small and ordinary town, had once again been given something extraordinary to discuss. The drizzle that had greeted Inspector Purbright as he left the town hall did little to quieten the town's appetite for speculation. By the following morning, Flaxborough's population had already absorbed, embroidered and redistributed the news of Mr. Gerald Venables's demise with the efficiency of a parish pump connected directly to a wireless mast. At Dagg's tea rooms, where pensioners liked to sit long over half-pints of weak tea and jam sandwiches described as homemade by no one in particular, Mrs. Blaine declared with grim relish that Venables had been poisoned. She based this on her late husband's experience with rat powder, which, she insisted, had left him green about the gills. Mr. Venables, she claimed, had shown the same hue as he slipped from his chair. This version of events crossed quickly to Mullet's Tobacconist, where men who enjoyed the air of hard knowledge about everything repeated it as fact. By the time Constable Love and his wife passed through the shop to buy a packet of pipe cleaners, the tale had expanded. Venables had been deliberately slipped something in his tea, and everyone knew who had been pouring it: the midwife herself. Mrs. Love, being a reasonable woman, dismissed this with a scornful sniff. "Midwives deliver babies, not poison," she said, but the remark was received with knowing looks and the sort of nodding that suggests disbelief in the words while enjoying the scandal. Inspector Purbright was at that same hour writing a short, preliminary note in his office at the police station. He had spent a quiet morning reading the constable's reports of last night's proceedings, and had underlined a phrase in Sergeant Malley's account. Subject appeared distracted prior to collapse. Purbright stared at those words with the mild frown of a man who sees in them no explanation but a possible beginning. It was at this moment that Mr. Chubb, the coroner, telephoned. Chubb was a round man with a voice that perpetually suggested apology for existing, though never enough to prevent him existing at great length. "Inspector," he began, "I thought it only decent to let you know. It appears our late Mr. Venables did not die of any natural seizure." Purbright, resting his chin on one hand, merely said, "Oh?" "There are traces," continued Chubb with faint horror, "of digitalis in his system, far more than could be accounted for by any treatment. It is my impression, no, my conclusion, that the gentleman was deliberately poisoned." Purbright thanked him gravely and replaced the receiver with the same calm he might use to close a filing drawer. He then reached for his coat, pausing only to tell Sergeant Malley, "I think, Sergeant, we ought to have another talk with Mrs. Threadgold." The midwife was at home, a narrow, terraced house, whose door carried brass polish with military regularity. She admitted Purbright without surprise, offered him tea without warmth, and sat stiffly opposite him in a parlour that smelled faintly of liniment. "You were the first to reach Mr. Venables," Purbright said after the civil preliminaries. "I was," she replied, hands folded on her skirt. "And you diagnosed his death as certain almost immediately." "That's correct, Inspector. I have seen enough not to be mistaken in that." Purbright nodded. He let silence gather, allowing her the opportunity to add more. She did. "I expect people are saying I killed him." Her voice carried no indignation, merely statement. "They are saying things," Purbright admitted softly. "As they always do." "It would help me, Mrs. Threadgold, if you could tell me whether Mr. Venables appeared to you at all. Altered before the collapse." Her gaze remained steady. "He was agitated, though he tried not to show it. I think he wanted to speak with me, but the speeches began and he never got round to it." Purbright inclined his head. "And had you reason, before yesterday, to think he wished to see you professionally?" "Not professionally, socially. A month ago he asked me to tea. I declined." "Why so?" "He was not my sort of company." The inspector did not smile, though the words amused him faintly. He asked a few more questions, none of which caused Mrs. Threadgold to shift or fidget. Her answers were precise, uncoloured by speculation. After 20 minutes, Purbright rose and took his leave, thanking her with a civility that was matched exactly in her curt nod. On his way back through the town centre, he paused to observe the little knots of townsfolk that seemed to have grown overnight. At the newsagent's counter, at the greengrocer's stall, at the bus stop, each group bent toward its own theory. They were, he reflected, like children bent over picture books, inventing more than they could see. By the evening, the gossip had hardened into factions. One camp insisted the midwife was somehow involved, citing her brisk announcement of death as suspicious efficiency. Another blamed Venables' fellow horticulturalists, noting with malicious pleasure his rivalries over prize chrysanthemums. A smaller but louder voice, belonging to Councillor Pike, suggested that Venables had enemies among the council itself, though Pike offered this with an air that somehow exonerated himself before anyone could suspect him. Purbright listened to all this through the mouths of others, chiefly Sergeant Malley, who brought him a digest of rumours each hour with the solemnity of delivering dispatches from the front. "Most people," Malley reported, "are agreed that Mr. Venables was not well liked." "That," said Purbright, removing his spectacles to polish them, "is generally true of the suddenly deceased." The following morning brought more substance. Dr. Fergus, the town's long-serving GP, provided a statement that Venables had never been prescribed digitalis, nor had he any known heart condition that might warrant it. The presence of the drug, therefore, was indisputably artificial. Armed with this fact, Purbright began his inquiries in earnest. He visited the Horticultural Society's committee room, a small, draughty space above the ironmonger's, where 3 earnest gardeners attempted to tidy papers while clearly preferring to gossip. From them, he learned of Venables' well-established enmities, his dispute with Mrs. Cartwright over the best soil for cucumbers, his prolonged quarrel with Mr. Beasley about greenhouse ventilation, and his tendency to sneer at anyone whose blooms failed to meet his exacting standard. "Truth is," Mr. Beasley muttered, "half of us might have wanted him gone, only none of us had the guts or the pills." It was an honest enough admission, and Purbright left them with a polite thank you, knowing full well that such squabbles, while colourful, rarely ripened into poisonings. Still the picture was forming. Venables had not been beloved, and opportunity for resentment was plentiful. Late that afternoon, as Purbright returned to the station, he paused once more at the market square. A small knot of women near the fountain were in animated discussion. As he drew closer, their voices became distinct. "And I saw her myself," one said, slipping a packet from her handbag before the poor man fell. "If that's not suspicious, I don't know what is." The others murmured agreement. Yet when Purbright looked directly at them, their voices trailed away and they stared at the ground, guilty of little more than rumour-mongering. He continued on, but the remark stayed with him. It was precisely the sort of tiny, trivial detail, possibly nothing, possibly everything, that he knew could not be ignored. That evening, as he sat at his desk with his pipe cooling beside him, Purbright allowed himself the faintest trace of reflection. Flaxborough's veneer of civic respectability always contained fissures, but seldom did they break open so quickly. Venables's death was a crime, yes, but also a mirror. People showed themselves most clearly when whispering about another. He leaned back, folded his hands, and murmured to the empty office, "Digitalis, gossip, and a woman who declined tea." Curious. Very curious indeed. The morning that opened Chapter 3 in the affair of Mr. Venables began with a thin sun stretching itself over Flaxborough, illuminating its red brick houses, its sober chapels, and its shops that offered more familiarity than variety. The town, for all its modest charms, was already enjoying a banquet of conjecture. By 9 o'clock, Miss Lucy Teat, whose hairdressing establishment was a recognized nerve centre for news, had given her customers not only a shampoo and set, but also a confident account of the Venables poisoning. "He was twitching, my dear, twitching," she declared to Mrs. Jackson, who sat beneath the dryer with only her nose protruding. And who was it right there at his side before anyone else? Mrs. Threadgold. She has hands that could bring life or take it away, believe you me. Mrs. Jackson, whose loyalty to accuracy extended only as far as the next sentence, repeated this within the hour to a grocer, who transformed the tale into one of Mrs. Threadgold administering a fatal draught on the spot. By the time Purbright heard the rumour at lunchtime from Sergeant Malley, it had become a story of the midwife pulling something out of her handbag, and, well, that was the end of him. Purbright listened, spectacles perched precariously low, and asked with polite dryness, "And has anyone, Sergeant, described what exactly this something might have been?" "No, sir, just something." "Ah, how admirably precise." Malley, faintly abashed, shifted his boots. "It does strike me odd. Sir, a woman like her, trusted by everyone, being spoken of like that." "Odd," said Purbright, "but not unusual. Trust, Sergeant, is as light as thistledown until a breath of scandal blows it away." Later that day, Purbright decided upon a more structured round of inquiries. He began with Councillor Horace Pike, whose agitation during the fatal evening had been pronounced enough to warrant another hearing. Pike received the inspector at his home, a red villa that aspired to grandeur through stained-glass panels and a proliferation of antimacassars. "Inspector," he said, ushering him into a sitting-room, heavy with the scent of pipe tobacco. It was a dreadful business, dreadful. Poor Venables, falling dead like that in the middle of civic duty, a martyr, you might say, to community service. Purbright, who doubted whether horticultural wrangles over chrysanthemums could elevate a man to martyrdom, allowed the phrase to pass unchallenged. Instead, he asked gently, "Did you know Mr. Venables well, Councillor?" Pike's expression suggested a calculation between truth and diplomacy. "Well enough. We sat together on the Parks subcommittee. He was meticulous, painfully so." "In what sense?" "In every sense. He would insist on debating the angle of a park bench as though it were the Treaty of Versailles. Many of us found it trying." Pike paused, then added in a lower tone, "I don't mind telling you, Inspector, there are members of the Council who regarded Venables as obstructive." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "And yet you seemed on the night particularly distressed." "Public duty, Inspector. One has to show one's feelings." Purbright looked at him mildly, as if weighing the exact proportion of sincerity to theatre, then concluded with polite thanks and withdrew. From Pike's villa he made his way across town to speak with Mrs. Beasley, widow of the late seed merchant, and an indefatigable presence at the Horticultural Society. Mrs. Beasley lived among a profusion of potted ferns in a house whose curtains had not been altered since the year of Queen Victoria's Jubilee. "You asked me about Mr. Venables," she began, barely allowing Purbright to sit. "I can tell you at once, Inspector, he was a tyrant. No one else's chrysanthemums were ever quite right. I grew blooms twice the size of his, but he said they lacked character." "Character? Imagine accusing a flower of lacking character," Purbright murmured sympathetically. "And as for poor Mrs. Threadgold," Mrs. Beasley went on, "it is monstrous, monstrous that people should suspect her. She has helped half the mothers in this town and never asked more than a cup of tea for it. But then, Inspector, you know what people are. They can't resist pulling down those they've had to look up to." This last remark Purbright considered with particular attention. It was delivered not as gossip, but as sober observation, which in Flaxborough was rare enough to be noteworthy. After half an hour of horticultural grievances, he took his leave. In the street outside he paused, adjusting his spectacles against the weak sunlight. Mrs. Beasley's words had lodged themselves with the persistence of burrs. Suspicion often followed respect as shadow follows light. That evening, Purbright received a visit from Dr. Fergus, who brought with him an air of professional irritation. "I cannot keep this quiet, Inspector," Fergus declared, sinking into the chair opposite Purbright's desk. "It's beyond a matter of medical discretion now. Venables did consult me last week. Not for his health, mind you. Oh no, he was as fit as his complaints allowed. He came to demand whether it was safe to administer digitalis to a perfectly healthy person." Purbright raised his eyebrows. "Did he say why such a question interested him?" "He muttered something about seeing through a lie. I told him it was absurd. Digitalis is not a toy." He left in a state of pique. Purbright thanked the doctor and sat for some time after he had gone, reflecting. Venables had suspected someone of deceit, someone close enough that he had considered testing them with poison, if only as a threat. The inspector found himself more curious than ever about the conversation Venables had apparently wished to have with Mrs. Threadgold before his collapse. The following day, Purbright arranged to speak once more with the midwife. She received him as before, calm and unsmiling. "Mrs. Threadgold," he said gently, "you mentioned that Mr. Venables seemed on the point of speaking to you. Do you suppose he intended to confide something or to accuse?" She hesitated. It was the first time Purbright had seen hesitation disturb her composure. "I believe," she said at length, "that he meant to tell me of some matter he thought urgent. He had hinted to me on another occasion that secrets in this town weighed more heavily than people liked to admit." Purbright inclined his head. "And did you know of any such secret, Mrs. Threadgold?" Her lips pressed together. "We all know fragments, Inspector. Flaxborough is a patchwork of half-secrets. It is the completed pattern we rarely see." He left her house with the impression, stronger now, that Mrs. Threadgold carried knowledge she would not yet disclose. Whether out of loyalty, fear, or stubborn principle, he could not tell. That evening, as the town lit its lamps and shopkeepers drew down their blinds, Purbright walked the market square at a slow pace. He passed groups of gossipers now so intent on their narratives that they barely noticed his presence. To them, Venables' death was already half a melodrama, complete with villains and heroines. Yet for Purbright the threads were still too few to weave into certainty. He thought again of digitalis, the deliberate, careful choice of a poisoner who wished death to resemble natural failure of the heart. It spoke not of temper, but of patience. Whoever had administered it had intended the act to slip beneath notice. Only Venables' collapse in so public a setting had thwarted that hope. As Purbright paused by the darkened door of Dagg's tea-rooms, He reflected that crimes in Flaxborough were rarely without some peculiar twist of human vanity. The town might seem ordinary, but its small grudges and concealed scandals had a way of fermenting into something sharper. Venables, pompous and unloved, had clearly stumbled upon one of those fermentations, and in seeking to expose it, he had himself been silenced. Purbright turned back toward the station, his coat collar raised against the night breeze. He knew that tomorrow's inquiries would need to move beyond gossip and gardening feuds. Somewhere in Flaxborough lay the quiet hand that had measured out digitalis for Gerald Venables. And that hand, though concealed for the moment among whispers and half-secrets, would in time betray itself. Inspector Purbright, unlike most men in Flaxborough, did not hurry to conclusions. He walked toward them with the same patience with which he would approach a nervous cat in a back garden, quietly, gently, and never with sudden gestures. That same caution guided him on the morning after his second visit to Mrs. Threadgold. The newspapers had caught up with the story. The Flaxborough Chronicle, in a tone of indignant sobriety, carried the headline, "Unexpected Death at Civic Event." The report beneath offered so few facts that the reader was obliged to supply his own, which, in Flaxborough, was never a difficulty. By noon, half the town believed Venables to have expired of natural causes, while the other half spoke with confidence of poisoning, conspiracy, and hidden feuds. Purbright, having folded the paper without visible irritation, set about the business of talking to those who had been in closest orbit of the dead man. He began with the staff of the council offices. Miss Peaver, the clerk typist, was first. She had the air of one who always knew more than she said, and who enjoyed hinting at knowledge without ever quite disclosing it. When Purbright asked whether Venables had seemed troubled in recent weeks, she pursed her lips like someone tasting an unripe gooseberry. "He was, restless," she admitted at last. "I saw him once standing by the filing cabinet, looking through the window as if the chrysanthemums were plotting against him. He muttered to himself. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded very cross." "And did he quarrel with anyone?" "Oh, everyone, Inspector. That was his way. Though I did hear him use the word liar one afternoon, quite loudly too. He was on the telephone, and I had no excuse to linger, so I cannot say more." Purbright inclined his head, thanked her courteously, and left her with the satisfaction of having been listened to. His next interview was with Mr. Hardacre, the town clerk, who had been visibly embarrassed on the night of the incident by Venables's unseemly collapse. Hardacre, a neat little man with a moustache that seemed more decisive than the rest of him, sat opposite Purbright in his narrow office. "Inspector," he said nervously, "you cannot imagine the inconvenience this affair has caused the council. There is already talk of cancelling the chrysanthemum exhibition. Quite unthinkable, unthinkable. I dare say the public would recover from the disappointment," Purbright said mildly. "But I should be grateful, Mr. Hardacre, if you would tell me whether Mr. Venables had enemies within the council itself." Hardacre cleared his throat. "Enemies is too strong a word. Resentments, certainly. He had a manner of insisting that his view alone was correct. He had, of late, pressed very strongly against certain proposals from Councillor Pike, matters concerning the leasing of allotments." "Ah." Purbright adjusted his spectacles. "And were those allotments valuable?" "They are sought after, Inspector, particularly those near the river, where the soil is rich. Venables suspected, indeed he accused, that Pike was attempting to secure one for a relative. There was some unpleasantness in committee." Purbright thanked him, left, and made a quiet note. Allotments, Pike. Accusation of favouritism. The afternoon took him to the ironmonger's, where Mr. Beasley was rearranging a stack of enamel buckets. Beasley was no less voluble than he had been before, but today his indignation was tinged with a curious defensiveness. Inspector, I'll tell you plainly, I disliked Venables. He belittled me in public, made a show of sneering at my blooms and mocked my greenhouse heating. But poison? No, sir. That is not my way. I would sooner have stuffed chrysanthemums down his throat and had done with it. Purbright, suppressing a smile, replied, I do not imagine it was your way, Mr. Beasley, yet you may have observed who else he quarrelled with. Beasley rubbed his chin. There was Mrs. Cartwright, of course. He accused her of pinching his soil mixture, and more than once he hinted that her husband, God rest him, had been less than honest in his business affairs. Venables could never resist scratching at old wounds. That evening, as Purbright sat in his office, his desk a litter of scribbled notes, Sergeant Malley entered with the look of a man bearing fresh morsels of gossip. Sir, you may be interested. Councillor Pike has been speaking freely at the pub. Says that Venables was determined to expose some matter of corruption at the council. Says he was ready to name names. Does Councillor Pike specify whose names? No, sir, but he was very red in the face when saying it, according to witnesses. Purbright leaned back, pipe stem resting against his teeth. A man shouting about corruption while ensuring no one suspects him is much like a burglar who reports his own house broken into. Malley grinned. And the midwife, sir? The talk about her isn't dying down. No, Purbright said quietly. It will not. Gossip requires a respectable figure to cling to like ivy to a church wall, but gossip is rarely proof. The following morning brought a change of scene. Purbright paid a call on Mrs. Cartwright, the widow whose cucumber growing had offended Venables' standards. She lived in a modest house on the edge of town, with a garden that overflowed with vegetables arranged in lines as straight as soldiers. Mrs. Cartwright, a brisk woman, with arms strengthened by years of hoeing, greeted him with blunt civility. You've come about Venables, I suppose? Well, Inspector, he was a bully. No sense denying it. He called me a cheat, a thief, and once, this in public, suggested I watered my lettuces with gin. Do I look the sort of woman who'd waste good gin on lettuces? Purbright conceded she did not. But poison? No, sir. I'd never risk the disgrace. My cucumbers may have a curl, but they're honest. The inspector spent half an hour listening to her catalogue of grievances, noting the recurring theme. Venables had been less interested in truth than in superiority. He had wielded suspicion as a weapon. It was, Purbright reflected, a dangerous pastime in a town where pride and secrecy were never far beneath the surface. As he walked back toward the station, the cobbles shining faintly in the afternoon light, Purbright considered the pattern emerging. Venables had been on the verge of exposing something. He had quarrelled not only with gardeners, but with councillors. He had spoken of liars, of corruption, of deceit, and then before he could name his target, he had swallowed digitalis. That evening, in the quiet of his office, Purbright allowed his thoughts to range freely. Suppose Venables had indeed discovered something, some petty dishonesty dressed in civic respectability. Who would have feared exposure enough to silence him? Councillor Pike with his allotments, another member of the Park Subcommittee, or, more strangely, Mrs. Threadgold, whose name the town was already twisting into a convenient suspect. He tapped the ash from his pipe and gazed at the wall. It was then that Sergeant Malley entered once more, carrying an envelope. "Message from Dr. Fergus, sir. He thought you'd want to see it tonight." Inside was a short note. "Inspector, in reviewing my records, I find that only last month I prescribed digitalis tablets for one patient, Mrs. Agnes Threadgold. For a minor heart irregularity, I trust this may be of interest." Purbright sat very still, the note resting beneath his hand. The town's whispers had, it seemed, found a fact to cling to. Whether it was fact enough remained to be seen. Inspector Purbright was not, as Sergeant Malley occasionally despaired, a man who leapt upon coincidences with both boots. He preferred to approach them as one might a patch of thin ice, carefully listening for cracks. Thus, when Dr. Fergus's note revealed that Mrs. Agnes Threadgold had access to digitalis, Purbright neither cried "aha" nor summoned a warrant. He merely folded the paper, placed it in the top drawer of his desk, and sat with the patient air of a man considering whether the evidence pointed forward or in quite another direction. The following morning was clear and brisk, the sort that set shopkeepers polishing windows in the belief that sunlight increased trade. Purbright set out across the market square, his pace unhurried, spectacles catching the gleam. The town was stirring with fresh gossip, and the inspector knew better than to let it go unmonitored. He entered Dag's tea rooms, where Mrs. Blaine and 2 other matrons were already installed. They fell into sudden, guilty silence as he approached the counter, but the blush on Mrs. Blaine's cheeks betrayed the subject of their chatter. Purbright, selecting a modest bun, took a seat within earshot. He neither spoke nor stared, merely let his presence become part of the furniture. After several minutes, the women, unable to resist the lure of their own voices, resumed. "Well, if she had the pills herself," Mrs. Blaine whispered, "how easy to slip 1 or 2 into a cup, and she did pour his tea, you'll remember." "Only because Mrs. Bloxby asked her to," another corrected, though not with much conviction. Purbright buttered his bun with deliberate slowness. The town's appetite for scandal was beginning to coalesce into a neat narrative. Midwife with access to digitalis, midwife pouring tea, Venables collapsing. It was almost too neat. Leaving the tea room, he walked to Mrs. Threadgold's house. She admitted him without surprise, as though she had expected this call. "You've spoken with Dr. Fergus?" she said simply, before Purbright could open his mouth. "I have received a note from him, yes." She seated herself opposite, hands folded, back straight. "Then you know I take a small dose of digitalis. It steadies the heart, nothing more." Purbright inclined his head. "It does, in moderate quantity. In excess, it brings the heart to a standstill." She did not flinch. "And you suspect me of supplying that excess?" "I suspect," Purbright said gently, "that Mr. Venables died of poison. It is my duty to consider every means by which he might have obtained it." The midwife's eyes, grey and steady, held his without wavering. "Inspector, I have spent my life bringing lives into this world. Do you think I should choose my retirement to begin taking them out of it?" Purbright let the silence grow. It was not her words that interested him, but the absence of fear in them. She did not plead nor protest. She stated. That calmness was in its way as curious as any confession. When he rose to leave, she added one remark. "Venables spoke to me the week before the meeting. He said he had proof. Proof that would shame someone on the council. He wouldn't say more. Perhaps he thought to draw me in, to use me as a witness when he exposed them, but he never had the chance." Purbright thanked her gravely and left. Her statement, if true, did little to lighten suspicion, but added a fresh dimension. Venables had intended some kind of revelation, and his death had silenced it. That afternoon Purbright made his way to the offices of the Flaxborough Chronicle. The editor, Mr. Bristow, greeted him with the mixture of respect and defensiveness that journalists reserve for policemen. "You've printed very little about Venables," Purbright observed mildly. "We are constrained, Inspector. One mustn't inflame public feeling without evidence." "Very prudent. And yet I imagine you have heard more than you have printed." Bristow cleared his throat. "Off the record, of course, I have been told Venables was preparing a letter for publication. He wanted to denounce certain members of the council for dishonesty. He never delivered it. Do you know what became of it? He had it with him, I believe, at the town hall, but nothing was found upon his person afterward. Purbright made another note. Missing letter. Possible motive. He left the Chronicle and walked across town, his coat buttoned against the sharp wind. The picture forming in his mind was still vague, but certain brush strokes stood out. Venables preparing an exposure, Venables seeking advice on digitalis, Venables hinting to Mrs. Threadgold of secrets, and then death and the disappearance of his letter. That evening, in the station office, Purbright and Sergeant Malley discussed the matter. "Sir," Malley said, "if the midwife had the means and the opportunity, doesn't that settle it?" "Means and opportunity, Sergeant, are like ink and paper. One still requires the hand that writes the message." "You think she's innocent?" "I think," Purbright replied, "that she may be used for convenience by those who find her a suitably respectable villain." Malley frowned. "But who else would have had the chance?" Purbright said nothing, but his gaze rested on the notes. Allotments, accusations, missing letter. 2 days later, a fresh incident stirred the town. Mrs. Beasley, returning from her greenhouse one evening, found her kitchen window forced. Nothing was stolen save a packet of seeds and, oddly, the minutes from the last Horticultural Society meeting. She reported the matter indignantly, and by the following morning the town was buzzing once more. "Burglary!" cried Mrs. Blaine in Dagg's tea rooms. "You mark my words, Inspector, someone is after Venables' papers. There's corruption in the soil of this town, and it will sprout wickedness." Purbright, who heard the tale soon enough, found himself in rare agreement. Not with Mrs. Blaine's metaphor, but with the substance. Someone indeed was after Venables' papers. Someone who wanted every trace of his accusations buried. That evening Purbright sat in his office, pipe unlit, fingers steepled. Venables' death no longer looked like the isolated malice of a single poisoner. It had the outlines of something broader: fear of exposure, fear of shame, fear of the small but devastating scandals that could unseat a man in a town like Flaxborough. Mrs. Threadgold remained, in the public imagination, the prime suspect. But in Purbright's mind, she was increasingly less so. A woman with nothing to hide did not meet questions with calm clarity unless she had long practice at confronting them. And he wondered, was her secret not guilt, but knowledge? Did she know who had cause to silence Venables? And was she holding back out of loyalty or fear? Purbright extinguished the lamp on his desk and closed his notes. Outside, the town lay in respectable quiet. Yet beneath that quietude, he knew, ran a current of deceit, a current that had carried Gerald Venables to his death, and sooner or later that current would surface again. Sergeant Malley, who had been nursing a cup of weak station tea for half an hour, greeted Inspector Purbright the following morning with an expression of mingled triumph and bafflement. "Sir," he began, rising as Purbright entered, "we've had a report from the chemist, Wainwright's, in the High Street. He says a gentleman came in a fortnight ago asking questions about digitalis. Not just questions, mind you, but precise ones. How much would it take to cause illness, whether it might be disguised in food or drink? Wainwright didn't think to write it down at the time, but after Venables' death, he says it seems worth mentioning." Purbright lowered himself into his chair and gestured for Malley to continue. "The description is vague," Malley admitted. "A man of middle years, ordinary build, dark suit, which accounts for about half the counsel, if you ask me." Purbright smiled faintly. "The chemist did not think it was Venables himself?" "No, sir. He was clear on that point. Said Venables was shorter, broader in the face. This chap was slimmer, hair thinning." The inspector leaned back, fingertips resting together. So Venables was not the only one contemplating the effects of digitalis. Looks that way, Mally agreed. But who and why? Purbright rose, crossing to the window. Outside, the square was already lively with carts and bicycles. The respectable facade of the town, polished daily like its brass knockers, gave no hint of poison and missing papers. Yet beneath it, the inspector knew currents were twisting tighter. By mid-morning, he had decided upon a visit to the council offices. It would not do to proceed without understanding the temper of that body to which Venables had belonged. The clerk, a thin man with a pencil moustache, received him with professional politeness. Yes, Inspector, of course we were all shocked. Mr. Venables was outspoken, certainly, but he cared about the town. He had his enemies, but don't we all? Indeed, Purbright said mildly. Tell me, had he spoken in recent weeks of bringing charges, moral, financial or otherwise, against his colleagues? The clerk hesitated. He did draft letters. I typed some of them myself. Strong words always, but I never saw the one he said would be the big one. He was most secretive about that. And who seemed uneasy in his company of late? The clerk shifted in his chair. Mr. Havelock, perhaps, and Councillor Pybus. Both felt Venables was stirring trouble about allotments and misused funds. He threatened to expose something, though I never heard details. Purbright thanked him and left, his mind circling round those names, Havelock, Pybus, both well ensconced in local affairs, both unlikely to relish scandal. If Venables truly held evidence, even a whiff of it might prompt desperate measures. That evening, Purbright walked home through the market square. The lamps glowed, the shop blinds drawn down, but a knot of townsfolk still lingered outside Dag's tea rooms, talking in urgent whispers. The inspector caught the tail of their conversation. Said she knew it all along, but won't tell, protecting someone, I'll wager. Purbright did not pause, but the words followed him. Protecting someone. They fitted uncomfortably well with his impression of Mrs. Threadgold. The following day, he called upon her again. She received him with the same composed courtesy. Mrs. Threadgold, he began, I must ask plainly, do you know who might have wished to silence Venables? She met his gaze levelly. Inspector, I know that Venables had become inconvenient. He was threatening to cast shadows where the town prefers sunshine. But names, no. Those who feared him would not confess their fear to me. Yet he confided in you? She shook her head. He tried, but I discouraged it. I wanted no part in his crusade. Purbright believed her, yet remained dissatisfied. There was a withholding in her voice, like a curtain drawn just shy of the window's edge. That afternoon, fresh evidence arrived of its own accord. A farm labourer brought to the station a scrap of paper he had found near the allotments, caught beneath a hedge. It was half of a letter scrawled in Venables' hand. Cannot remain silent any longer, it read. The misuse of funds is clear, and I shall put the truth before the Chronicle. If certain members wish to spare themselves disgrace, they must make amends now, before... The rest was torn away. Purbright examined the scrap gravely. Here was proof that Venables had indeed been preparing a revelation. And here, perhaps, was the cause of his death. Mally, watching, was more direct. Then it's one of the councillors, sir. Havelock, Pybus, someone like that. Poisoned him before he could publish. Perhaps, Purbright murmured. But the method remains troublesome. To slip digitalis into a teacup at a public meeting requires nerve, planning, and certainty that the right man will drink, unless Venables himself carried something, and it was exchanged. Mally frowned. Exchanged by whom? That, said Purbright, is the question. The days that followed brought little rest. The burglary at Mrs. Beasley's house still nettled him. The missing papers, the torn letter, the whispered accusations, together they formed a pattern of deliberate erasure. Someone was tidying the trail Venables had left. On the third evening after the letter's discovery, Purbright received a discreet visitor, Mr. Bristow of the Chronicle. The editor looked pale, harried. "Inspector," he said after the door was closed, "I've been keeping something back. Venables entrusted me with a sealed envelope to be opened only if anything befell him. I confess I feared to mention it earlier, but now, well, I dare not keep it longer." He produced the envelope, its flap intact, Venables's name scrawled across the front. Purbright accepted it gravely. "Thank you, Mr. Bristow. Whatever is inside, it may cost reputations, but concealment would cost more." The editor departed, leaving Purbright alone with the envelope. He broke the seal carefully. Inside lay 3 sheets closely written. The accusations were explicit: misuse of municipal funds, improper contracts, and the diversion of allotment revenues. Venables named councillors Havelock and Pybus directly, describing meetings, sums, and witnesses. It was not conclusive proof, but it was enough to destroy them publicly. At the bottom, Venables had written, "If I do not deliver this myself, it is because those men have sought to prevent it." Purbright replaced the papers, his face unreadable. The case, at last, was beginning to speak plainly. Venables had prepared his exposure. His enemies had reason to silence him. Digitalis was the weapon, the teacup the stage. And yet, one question gnawed: who had placed the poison? Havelock? Pybus? Or some obliging hand acting for them? As the church clock struck midnight, Inspector Purbright sat alone in his office, pipe unlit, considering the shape of events. The town of Flaxborough slept, confident in its decency. But in its heart 2 councillors, and perhaps others still, lay awake, listening for the knock that would soon enough come upon their doors. The case was no longer about suspicion, it was about proof. And proof, Purbright knew, would require patience, precision, and perhaps a touch of deceit of his own. The following morning dawned damp and uncertain, the kind of half-light in which Flaxborough's tiled rooftops looked like rows of guilty shoulders hunched against the drizzle. Inspector Purbright, whose temperament rarely bent to weather, found the greyness useful. People were inclined to stay indoors, to speak in lower tones, and sometimes to confess more readily when reminded of their own frailty. At the police station, Sergeant Malley was already in possession of news. He had stationed himself with coffee and a grimace behind a desk littered with notes. "Sir," he announced as Purbright entered, "I've taken the liberty of looking into Councillor Pybus's activities. His accounts are in a muddle, more than a muddle actually. There's a gap of about £200 in the allotment rents. He claims it went into improvements, but no one has seen them." Purbright slipped off his overcoat and glanced at the papers. £200, he mused. Enough to tempt a small man into a large mistake. And enough, if discovered, to ruin him. Malley nodded. Havelock's cleaner, at least on paper. But he's thick as thieves with Pybus. Could be that one carried the purse while the other stood watch. Purbright sat, lighting his pipe with the kind of deliberation that discouraged haste. "We must be careful, Sergeant. Men of civic standing are like old furniture. Attack one leg and the whole sideboard collapses. The noise it makes brings neighbours running, and then there are questions about who did the pushing." Malley looked faintly disappointed. "So we let them wobble a bit longer, sir?" "For now," Purbright replied. "Let us see who tries hardest to steady the peace." By mid-morning, Purbright paid a visit to the town hall under the pretence of inquiring into routine police council matters. Councillor Havelock, summoned from a committee room, arrived with a face set in politeness but not warmth. "My dear Inspector," he said too cheerfully, What brings you here in these dreary times, still picking over poor Venables' bones? Purbright regarded him placidly. Only tidying loose ends. It seems he was preparing some allegations of impropriety. I thought you might be able to help. Havelock laughed, a note sharper than intended. Allegations! Venables made a career of them, always scribbling, always threatening to publish some nonsense. The man was a bore and a danger to civic unity. I don't doubt he would have tried to drag our names through the mud if death hadn't silenced him first. Purbright allowed silence to stretch until Havelock shifted in his chair. Then the inspector said softly, "It is curious that you mention names being dragged, Councillor. Venables' last letter, in fact, bore yours." The colour drained a little from Havelock's cheeks. He attempted a smile. "Did it, though? Well, I should not be surprised. A man bent on mischief will strike wherever he thinks it will hurt." Purbright made no reply, but his gaze rested on Havelock until the councillor began to fidget with his cufflink. The inspector left soon after, satisfied that discomfort had been ceded. Meanwhile, Sergeant Malley pursued another line. He called on Mrs. Beasley, the widow whose house had been burgled. She met him in a parlour crowded with photographs and the faint odour of furniture polish. "Papers missing, you say?" Malley prompted, notebook ready. Mrs. Beasley nodded gravely. "2 folders from the desk. They were Arthur's. He often helped Mr. Venables with bookkeeping. Notes about allotments, rent receipts. Why anyone should want them, I cannot imagine." Malley could imagine very well. "And did your husband mention who might object to Mr. Venables' inquiries?" The widow pursed her lips. "Arthur did say Councillor Pybus seemed uneasy whenever Mr. Venables came round, and Mr. Havelock once told Arthur that too much poking into council funds was unhealthy work. I remember because I thought it an odd phrase." When Malley repeated this to Purbright that evening, the inspector received it with calm satisfaction. The noose of suspicion, though not yet evidence, was tightening neatly around the same pair of necks. Yet Purbright remained troubled. If Pybus and Havelock were guilty, how precisely had they arranged Venables' death? Men of their kind were adept at evasions, but murder required a degree of skill and risk that did not sit easily with their comfortable lives. He turned the problem over while walking back through the square, his thoughts interrupted by a chance encounter. A young woman hurrying from the post office almost collided with him. She was Miss Clara Green, secretary to the town clerk, and known for her discreet efficiency. "Forgive me, Inspector," she said breathlessly. "I'm late to deliver these minutes." Purbright's eye fell on the bundle she carried, neatly tied. He noted the careful order, the precise handwriting on the outer sheet. An idea began to form. "Miss Green," he asked gently, "do you happen to recall whether Mr. Venables ever left papers with the clerk's office? Letters, perhaps?" She hesitated, glancing about. "Only once. A large envelope marked for the Chronicle. He asked me to put it in the strong box until he collected it. That was 3 weeks ago. When I looked yesterday, it was gone." Purbright raised his brows. "Gone?" "Yes." I said nothing. One doesn't question such matters in the town hall, but I thought you ought to know. This revelation struck the inspector as more significant than any account ledger. Venables had placed his evidence where he thought it safe. Someone inside had seen to its disappearance. That night, Purbright convened a quiet meeting in his office with Malley and Sergeant Love, a younger officer whose unobtrusiveness made him useful. "The papers Venables lodged are missing," Purbright explained. "Their removal points to someone with access, Havelock or Pybus most likely, but perhaps through an obliging subordinate. We must discover which." Love asked, "Do we set a watch, sir?" "Not yet," Purbright replied. "Instead, we shall invite our suspects to betray themselves. A man who believes he has destroyed all evidence sleeps well. A man who fears something remains hidden will stir. Igi paused, tapping ash from his pipe. Tomorrow I propose to let it be known, carelessly as though by chance, that Venables's full dossier has come into our hands. We shall see who grows restless. Malley grinned. That ought to shake them like ferrets in a sack. The plan was simple enough. A whisper here, a remark there, a nod towards the Chronicle offices. Within 2 days, word had spread with that peculiar efficiency reserved for small towns in which gossip travelled faster than mail. The results were swift. Councillor Pybus called at the police station, feigning indignation. "I hear you've been bandying my name about, Inspector. Venables was a liar, and any documents you claim to hold are forgeries." Purbright received him with bland courtesy. "Forgive me, Councillor. I did not say we possessed documents, only that certain matters were being examined." Pybus blustered, perspiring, then left abruptly. That evening, Havelock was observed by Sergeant Love slipping into Bristow's office at the Chronicle, emerging 15 minutes later with a face pale and drawn. Purbright, informed of this, allowed himself the faintest smile. The bait had been taken. Now came the task of reeling in. As the church clock tolled midnight once more, Purbright sat alone with his notes. Around him the silence of the station was deep, but his mind ticked steadily. Pybus was frightened, Havelock desperate. The missing dossier had unsettled them both as he had intended. Yet one question remained unresolved, the hand that poured the poison. Pybus and Havelock had motive, fear, and opportunity to suppress papers. But who in that crowded meeting room had slipped the fatal draught into Venables's cup? Until that answer emerged, suspicion was not enough. Proof was the quarry, and it still ran ahead in the dark. Purbright knocked the ash from his pipe, extinguished the lamp, and stepped into the night. The drizzle had ceased, leaving the cobbles shining faintly beneath the moon. Somewhere in the shadows of Flaxborough, the truth waited, patient as a hunter, and the inspector, with equal patience, prepared to draw nearer to it. The next morning carried with it a deceptive brightness. After days of rain and mist, Flaxborough awoke beneath a sun that gilded its rooftops and sparkled in puddles left behind on cobbles. Shopkeepers flung open their doors with the air of people trying to believe in good fortune, though the town's undercurrent of unease remained steady, if unspoken. Inspector Purbright, standing at the window of his office, considered that sunshine rarely altered men's consciences, only their shadows. He had spent much of the night sifting the tangle of motives and lies, and the clarity he sought still seemed just out of reach. Venables's death had disturbed too many layers of civic propriety to be explained by mere accident or impulse. Sergeant Malley entered, carrying the Morning Post with a gravity befitting state secrets. He placed 3 envelopes on the desk. "Nothing explosive, sir, unless you count the rates demand." Purbright smiled faintly, opening the top envelope with his penknife. Inside was a brief note, unsigned, written in a spidery hand. "Ask at the allotments hut after dark. You will find more than vegetables." He passed it silently to Malley, who frowned. "Looks like a hoax." "Possibly," Purbright agreed. But Venables's interest in the allotments was genuine enough. If the note is a lure, it may nonetheless lead us closer to the snare. "Shall we go ourselves tonight, sir?" Malley asked. Purbright shook his head. "Patience, Sergeant. We shall observe, not intrude. A man who leaves such a message may prefer to reveal himself to shadows rather than uniforms." The day wore on with small, useful discoveries. Sergeant Love, who had been discreetly tracking Councillor Havelock's movements, reported that the councillor had spent much of the afternoon in anxious conference with Pybus. They met at the Masonic rooms, Love said, and emerged separately, but both looked like men who'd bitten into something sour. Purbright nodded. A fellowship of mutual terror, perhaps. Nothing binds men like the fear of exposure. At dusk, Inspector and sergeants drove quietly to the allotments. The hut in question, a corrugated iron structure with peeling green paint, crouched at the far end of the plots like a guilty conscience. The sun had set, leaving a pale wash of colour behind the hedges. From a concealed vantage behind a half-ruined greenhouse, the policeman watched. Hours seemed to stretch, filled with the smell of damp soil and the occasional rustle of a rabbit. Then at 10:30, a lantern bobbed along the path. A figure approached the hut, glanced nervously around and entered. Purbright, peering through the gloom, recognized the outline of Councillor Pybus. For several minutes there was no sound but the faint scrape of a box being dragged. Then the lantern's glow shifted, and Pybus emerged, carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper. He paused, listening, then hurried away into the night. Mally whispered, "Shall I follow?" "Not close," Purbright murmured. "We don't want him to smell the fox behind him, but make note of where he goes." Mally slipped into the darkness after Pybus, returning an hour later with news. He took it straight to Havelock's house, knocked once, slipped inside, and stayed no more than 10 minutes, left without the parcel. Purbright tapped his pipe thoughtfully against his boot. So, the contents are for Havelock. Whatever Venables gathered has now passed through 2 guilty hands. The next morning, Purbright requested a quiet word with Mr. Bristow, editor of the Flaxborough Chronicle. Bristow was an eager man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous habit of smoothing his hair whenever serious matters arose. "I wonder," Purbright asked mildly, "whether Mr. Venables ever lodged material with your office intended for publication?" Bristow's eyes darted sideways. "Well, he often threatened it, Inspector. He said he had a story that would blow the council apart, but he never actually brought me the full article, just hints, notes." He broke off, troubled. Purbright leaned forward slightly. "Did anyone else inquire about his papers? After his death, perhaps?" The editor hesitated, then confessed. "Yes. Councillor Havelock called. Very insistent he was that any papers Venables might have left should be destroyed at once for the good of the town. I told him we had nothing. He left in a fury." The inspector thanked him and walked away with a deepening conviction. Havelock's fear had grown urgent enough to betray itself. That afternoon, Purbright took tea at Mrs. Beasley's again, under the pretext of further inquiries. She proved unexpectedly talkative, perhaps relieved at company after weeks of grief. "My Arthur always said," she remarked, pouring tea into fragile cups, "that Pybus was the sort of man who would rather destroy evidence than face it. And Havelock, well, he could make evil sound like civic duty. He once told Arthur, sometimes it is healthier for the town not to know too much." Purbright gave a polite nod, though the phrase struck him with force. It matched what Miss Green had already reported word for word. The councillor's carelessness in repeating himself suggested both arrogance and desperation. By evening, Purbright felt the threads of his net tightening, but one question still gnawed. Who had delivered the fatal dose to Venables? Men like Havelock and Pybus had motives aplenty, yet the act itself required a hand, unremarked, in a crowded room. He considered the town hall meeting again, the bustle, the cups of tea, the press of papers. Venables had been loud, his accusations too pointed, a moment's inattention, and his cup could easily have been tampered with. But by whom? A councillor? Or someone less visible, one of the clerks or attendants who moved in and out quietly? At 10 o'clock that night, as Purbright sat with Mally reviewing notes, a knock sounded at the station door. Miss Clara Green stood there, pale and anxious. "I must speak to you," she whispered. "It's about Mr. Venables's envelope." "In his office," she explained, wringing her hands. "When I saw it missing from the strong-box, I suspected Councillor Havelock. But last night I remembered something. On the day Venables lodged the papers, Mr. Pybus came in afterwards asking for the key to the box. He said he needed to deposit council receipts. I gave it to him. It was routine. I thought nothing of it. Now I fear—" "You fear correctly," Purbright said gently. "You have been most helpful, Miss Green." Her eyes filled with tears. "I did not know he would be killed. I never dreamed—" Purbright assured her she bore no blame. But her testimony was the missing hinge. Pybus had accessed the strong-box, likely removed the dossier, and from there the conspiracy with Havelock took its darker turn. When she had gone, Mally muttered, "What nails Pybus for theft, at least." "But the poison, sir?" Purbright nodded slowly. Still unanswered. Yet theft and murder often share the same trembling hands. And tonight, I think, Pybus's hands will tremble indeed. For the inspector had resolved upon a subtle trap. A whisper would reach both councillors by morning. The police now possessed Venables's notes in full, complete with proof of financial impropriety. What the suspects believed destroyed had, so the rumour would claim, survived, intact. "Fear," Purbright murmured as he extinguished the office lamp, "is the surest accomplice of justice. Let us see what our gentlemen do when they believe their ruin is already written." Outside, the town lay quiet under starlight, the river glimmering faintly beyond the square. But beneath its calm surface, a reckoning stirred, one that would, before long, compel Pybus and Havelock into desperate movement, and perhaps into the open arms of the law. The rumour took hold of Flaxborough with remarkable speed. By midday the following day, whispers moved as swiftly as if borne on the river wind itself. The police had Venables's papers, every damning line intact, every receipt and affidavit preserved. None could say from whom the news had come, only that it was certain, unquestionable. In the snug of the Anchor and Crown, men leaned across their pints to mutter theories. In the hairdressers, ladies had it confirmed between snips of scissors. Even the postmistress, who prided herself on scepticism, remarked that Inspector Purbright had looked uncommonly cheerful when he collected his morning letter. For the councillors most intimately concerned, it was less a rumour than a thunderclap. At Town Hall, Pybus avoided the gaze of everyone, perspiration shining on his brow despite the draughty corridors. Councillor Havelock, meanwhile, walked stiffly as though rehearsing the dignity of a martyr. Both men sent urgent notes to one another, notes carried by nervous boys who sensed more danger than either councillor dared admit aloud. Purbright, observing this silent panic through the reports of Sergeant Love, remained outwardly mild. He spent much of the afternoon at his desk, reviewing ledgers and pretending to puzzle over committee minutes, though his real interest lay in watching how the quarry reacted to the scent of the hounds. By evening he was rewarded. Sergeant Mally entered briskly, suppressing a smile. "They've arranged a meeting, sir. Pybus and Havelock. 9 o'clock sharp at the solicitor's office. After hours." Purbright nodded. "Excellent. Have we someone inside?" "Love has already bribed the charwoman to leave a side window unlatched. We'll hear every word if we keep quiet enough." At 10 minutes to 9, Purbright, Mally and Love crouched in the alley behind the solicitors. The lane smelled of damp mortar and coal dust. From their position beneath the window, they could hear the scrape of chairs within. Havelock's voice came first, measured, haughty, yet tinged with strain. "You assured me, Pybus, that all of Venables's papers were destroyed." They were, Pybus hissed. I burned them myself, but if the police claim otherwise, it is not the claim that matters, you fool. It is the perception. Do you imagine for a moment that Bristow at the Chronicle will hold his tongue if Purbright truly has the material? One article in print and we are ruined, utterly. There was the clink of glass, as though Pybus had poured himself a desperate measure. His voice trembled. Perhaps they only bluff. Perhaps they hope to frighten us into mistakes. And what? Havelock demanded icily. Would you call this state of nerves, if not a mistake? Pull yourself together. We must consider whether more decisive action is required. Purbright, listening in the shadows, exchanged a glance with Mally. The counsellor's tone carried a coldness too deliberate for mere bluster. Inside, Pybus muttered, "Another death? Is that what you mean? You talk as if it were nothing. Venables was one thing, an accident forced by necessity. But another—" "It may not be necessary," Havelock cut in sharply. "But if Miss Green were to suffer a sudden mishap, for instance, the thread to us would be severed. She knows more than she ought, and rumour has a way of clinging to the mouths of women." Pybus groaned. God help us. First Venables, now her— Purbright raised a hand, signalling silence among his men. Every word struck home, though not enough for an arrest yet. Better, he thought, to let the rope tighten further of its own accord. When at last the meeting ended and the two counsellors parted ways into the night, Purbright gave quiet orders. Mally was to follow Havelock, Love to trail Pybus. The inspector himself returned to the station, where he sat smoking thoughtfully, weighing the conversation. By 11:30, both sergeants were back with reports. Havelock had gone directly home, though he spent a long hour pacing in his study, curtains drawn. Pybus, meanwhile, had staggered into the Anchor and Crown and drunk himself nearly insensible. "It's clear, sir," Mally said. "They're terrified." "Yes," Purbright murmured, "but terror makes men reckless, and reckless men provide evidence." The following morning, Purbright paid a visit to Miss Clara Green, accompanied by Mally for propriety. He explained gently but firmly what he had overheard. Her face paled, yet her jaw tightened with quiet courage. "So they would silence me as they silenced him," she said softly. "Very well, then I shall not keep silence." Purbright regarded her gravely. "Your testimony may become the lever that brings them down, but it will also place you in danger. I should prefer you lodged in a safer place until we act." She agreed without fuss, though her hands trembled as she packed a small case. That evening she was conveyed discreetly to the house of Purbright's widowed sister in the neighbouring parish, a kindly soul with no connection to Flaxborough politics. With Miss Green secure, Purbright turned his attention to securing physical proof. Words overheard in darkness were valuable, but in court they required bolstering. If only a scrap of Venables' dossier still existed, some fragment overlooked by Pybus's fire. It was Love who struck gold. Rummaging through the allotments hut again, he discovered beneath a false board a charred envelope, edges blackened, but contents still legible in part. It contained receipts showing payments from a building contractor to Councillor Havelock, sums far beyond legitimate fees. Purbright examined them with satisfaction. "The dead man left us his voice after all. Now we need only press these gentlemen until they shout their guilt aloud." The trap was set for the council meeting scheduled that Friday evening. The agenda, innocuous enough on paper, was expected to draw a fair attendance, more than a few citizens having scented drama in recent events. As councillors shuffled papers and cleared throats under the buzzing lamps of the chamber, Purbright and his sergeants took unobtrusive positions at the back. Miss Green, kept from view, remained safe with Purbright's sister, but her sworn statement already lay in the inspector's breast pocket. The meeting began dully, but tension rippled whenever Havelock spoke. At length, Councillor Pybus rose to move some trivial motion regarding allotment fees. His hand shook, and his voice cracked. Murmurs stirred in the gallery. At that moment Purbright stepped forward, calm and steady. "Mr. Chairman," he said mildly, "before this council proceeds further, I must present certain documents recovered in connection with the death of Councillor Venables." Gasps fluttered through the hall. Purbright laid the charred receipts upon the table. These papers, partly damaged by fire, nevertheless make clear reference to payments improperly received. They were found hidden in the allotment hut, in circumstances most suspicious. I have reason to believe they were removed from Venables' possession shortly before his death. Havelock sprang to his feet, face mottled with rage. "This is outrageous! You have no authority to besmirch." "On the contrary," Purbright interrupted softly, "I have both authority and obligation. And unless those responsible wish to offer explanation here and now, I shall be compelled to place them under arrest." For a long, frozen moment the chamber held its breath. Pybus swayed, his mouth working soundlessly. Then, as though the weight of fear proved too great, he burst out, "It was him! Havelock forced it. Venables threatened us. And he said the town must be rid of him." The hall erupted in cries of shock. Havelock lunged forward, fists clenched, but Purbright stepped between, his voice cutting cleanly through the din. "That will suffice. Sergeant Malley, Sergeant Love, take them both into custody." As the sergeants moved, Havelock's bluster collapsed into a bitter sneer. "Do you imagine, Inspector, that one death will buy you peace? Flaxborough thrives on its secrets. You cut away one weed, 10 more will grow." Purbright regarded him steadily. "Perhaps. But weeds, Councillor, flourish best in silence. Sunlight, even a little, can wither them quickly." The councillors were led out, the chamber still buzzing with disbelief. Purbright gathered the papers, his expression unreadable. The case was far from closed. The law would have its lengthy course. Evidence must be weighed, motives untangled. But the central knot had been cut, and Venables, noisy prophet though he had not died entirely unheard. Later, alone in his office, Purbright lit his pipe and gazed at the lamplight reflected in the darkened window. Outside, Flaxborough's streets were quiet again, though tomorrow they would teem with gossip. Yet beneath the chatter, something vital had shifted. The councillor's power, once so secure, now lay broken. And still the inspector wondered, had justice been fully served or merely begun? The question lingered like smoke in the air as midnight tolled across the rooftops. The trial of Councillors Havelock and Pybus was not due for several weeks, yet already Flaxborough had transformed itself into a miniature theatre of speculation. Every shop counter became a debating floor, every barber's chair a pulpit. Even the market women, who ordinarily reserved their breath for haggling over turnips, now discoursed with gravity on the finer points of motive and opportunity. It was in this climate of avid chatter that Inspector Purbright found himself confronted by one of the more delicate challenges of his profession, the interval between arrest and conviction. Public appetite, he knew, could not be trusted to distinguish between rumour and evidence, nor could it be expected to remain satisfied with silence. At his desk, Purbright surveyed the latest chronicle, whose front page bore the headline, "Councillors in Murder Plot." The question mark did little to soften the impact. A grainy photograph of Havelock glowering at the camera suggested guilt of Shakespearean proportions. Pybus appeared in another shot, caught in the act of dabbing his brow with a handkerchief, looking every bit the tragic accomplice. The inspector sighed and folded the paper. "Our good friend Mr. Bristow has discovered punctuation," he murmured. "A question mark is his contribution to jurisprudence." Sergeant Malley, entering with a sheaf of notes, grinned. "The town's lapping it up, sir. You'd think we'd staged the whole affair for their entertainment." Purbright allowed himself a thin smile. "In many ways, Sergeant, we have. The performance of justice, though earnest, is also a drama. It requires not merely truth, but a convincing production." He lit his pipe, sending up a contemplative wreath of smoke. "And yet," he added quietly, "there remains something unsatisfying. Venables may have unearthed corruption, and yes, the councillors feared him enough to conspire. But I wonder, was his death entirely the consequence of politics? Or was there another string in this dismal puppet show?" Malley raised his eyebrows. "You suspect someone else?" "Not suspect, Sergeant. But I remain wary of conclusions that arrange themselves too neatly." That afternoon, Purbright received a visit from Miss Clara Green, escorted by a constable for safety. She entered the inspector's office with a composure that surprised him. Only her pale cheeks betrayed the ordeal she endured. "I thought you should know, Inspector," she began, "that before Venables died, he spoke of a third name. He mentioned it only once, and in passing, but I recall it clearly. He said, 'If Havelock fails me, then Hallows will listen.'" "Hallows," Purbright repeated. "You are certain?" "Yes." He didn't explain further. The inspector leaned back, fingers steepled. "Curious. Alderman Hallows is not a man one associates with Venables' brand of righteous agitation. His interests lie more in brewery shares and ensuring his lawn receives municipal water at half rate." Miss Green lowered her voice. "Might it be that Venables confided in him, perhaps entrusted some portion of his papers?" Purbright studied her face. "You may very well be right, Miss Green. Thank you. Your memory may yet prove decisive." When she had gone, he summoned Malley. "Find out everything you can about Alderman Hallows's movements during the weeks before Venables' death. Discreetly, if you please." By evening, Malley returned with preliminary results. Hallows attended nearly every committee meeting except the one Venables stormed out of. He also visited the allotments twice, claiming to be inspecting drainage. "And," Malley shuffled his notes, "there's something else. He was seen in the company of a woman named Margaret Dainty. She's employed at the undertaker's, part-time typist for the obituary notices." Purbright's eyes sharpened. "Obituaries again? Curious how often the dead intrude upon our living affairs." "She's no more than a typist, sir," Malley said cautiously. "Perhaps, or perhaps she is something rather more significant. If Venables entrusted part of his evidence to her, documents disguised among obituary drafts, say, the councillors might not have destroyed the whole." The inspector rose. "Let us pay Miss Dainty a visit." Margaret Dainty lived in a modest terrace, its small garden meticulously kept, each flower bed precise as if drawn with a ruler. She admitted Purbright and Malley with wary politeness. "I've told the police everything I know," she said at once, smoothing her apron. "If it's about poor Councillor Venables, well, he was always scribbling in the office, muttering about papers, but I had nothing to do with it." Purbright's expression remained gently encouraging. "We understand, Miss Dainty, but perhaps you might recall if he ever gave you anything unusual to type or keep safe. He trusted you, I think?" She hesitated. A long pause stretched, filled only by the faint tick of the mantel clock. Then she reached into a drawer and produced a small bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon. "He asked me to hold these," she whispered. "Said if anything happened to him, I must give them to someone I trusted." I didn't know whether to hand them in, but now, with all that's been said, I suppose you're the one he meant." Purbright accepted the bundle with grave courtesy. "You did right, Miss Dainty. You may have preserved the voice of the dead." Back at the station, he examined the contents. There were letters, some typed, others handwritten, all concerning irregular payments made by contractors to certain councillors, Havelock and Pybus among them, but also, most damningly, Alderman Hallows. So Venables's reach had extended further than anyone suspected. The next day, Purbright visited the mayor, a plump gentleman whose chief pleasure in life was ceremonial robes. He laid the papers before him. The mayor's jowls quivered as he read. "Good heavens, Hallows as well? Why, he's practically the cornerstone of the borough." "Then perhaps, your worship," Purbright replied dryly, "our borough requires new masonry." The mayor dabbed his forehead. "What do you propose?" "That we wait. The trial of Havelock and Pybus will proceed, but meanwhile we quietly prepare a second case. To strike too hastily at Hallows would be to warn him. Better to let him stew while we gather every nail for his coffin." The mayor shuddered at the metaphor, but nodded. That evening, Purbright called together his sergeants. The office smelled of damp paper and tobacco smoke. "We have entered the second act, gentlemen," he announced. "The first curtain fell with the arrest of Havelock and Pybus, but Venables's drama has a longer cast list. Alderman Hallows must be watched closely. He will not sit idle while his fellow conspirators face the gallows. Expect him to stir, to reach for allies, perhaps even to silence those who hold his secrets." Love frowned. "You mean Miss Dainty, sir?" "Precisely. She must be protected, as must Miss Green. 2 women now carry more weight than the entire council chamber. See to it that neither is left alone or unguarded." Malley nodded briskly. Purbright tamped the ashes in his pipe. "Venables was an inconvenient prophet, but prophets rarely labour alone. He sowed seeds of truth in odd furrows, and now we must reap them carefully, lest thorns grow too." The sergeants exchanged glances, sensing that their inspector's calm words concealed a sharpened vigilance. Outside, the rain began again, pattering against the windows of the station. Within, Purbright sat quietly, contemplating the peculiar persistence of a dead man's voice, one that seemed determined to guide the living toward reckoning, whether they wished it or not. And so Chapter 10 closed with the borough of Flaxborough balanced uneasily between scandal and revelation, its genteel surface barely concealing the turbulence beneath. The trial awaited. Hallows plotted in silence, and Purbright, pipe glowing in the dim light, prepared for the next turn in a case that refused the courtesy of ending. The Crown Court of Flaxborough was, in its everyday operation, a modest affair. Petty thefts, disputes over allotment hedges, and the occasional intoxicated scuffle supplied its drama. But when councillors Havelock and Pybus were brought to stand trial for conspiracy to murder, the old hall transformed itself into a stage whose performance no citizen would willingly miss. On the morning proceedings opened, every bench was filled, and those without seats pressed at the doors or crowded into nearby tea shop, where whispered bulletins travelled faster than any official report. Mrs. Virtue, the baker's wife, relayed accounts with such embellishment that her descriptions were soon richer than the evidence itself. Inside, the high windows admitted pale light. The judge, an austere man with a voice like a cracked bell, surveyed the court with evident distaste at its carnival atmosphere, yet he too seemed aware that the trial was less a legal formality than a civic spectacle. Inspector Purbright, seated unobtrusively at the rear, observed both the accused and the audience. Havelock, square and immovable, sat with the defiance of one who still clung to his dignity. Pybus, by contrast, appeared a man already broken, his lips perpetually moistening as if searching for words he dared not speak. The Crown's barrister, a wiry fellow with an alarming fondness for rhetorical flourishes, presented the case with relish. He depicted the councillors as corrupt men driven by greed, their conspiracy against Councillor Venables a desperate act to silence exposure. Letters, minutes of secret meetings, and testimony from Miss Clara Green were laid out with steady progression. Clara, pale but resolute, gave her account clearly. She described Venables' growing fears, his insistence that he had uncovered damning corruption, and the threats he confided receiving. Under the defence's cross-examination, she did not waver, though her hands tightened in her lap. When she stepped down, Purbright inclined his head slightly in silent acknowledgement. She had withstood the ordeal with courage. In the days that followed, the cheeked town's gossip oscillated with each witness. Some declared the councillors surely guilty, others insisted the prosecution's case was stitched from supposition. Yet for Purbright, the greater significance lay not in the courtroom itself, but in the ripples beyond it. For Alderman Hallowes had taken to conspicuous absence. His usual haunts, the golf club, the snug of the King's Arms, saw him less often. He sent apologies to committees, citing indisposition. But Malley's discreet surveillance revealed that the alderman was neither ill nor idle. He received several late-night visitors, men of obscure occupation, but quick departures. Purbright considered this over his pipe one evening. The councillors on trial might be securely fenced by barristers and warders, but Hallowes roamed free, a wounded stag more dangerous for his invisibility. Meanwhile, another witness emerged, Margaret Dainty. The young typist, though reluctant, was persuaded to testify after Purbright assured her of protection. She carried into court the very documents Venables had entrusted to her, letters detailing bribes, contracts, and signatures, among which Hallowes's name appeared repeatedly. The barrister flourished these papers before the jury as if they were holy writ. Havelock glared at the bundle. Pybus buried his face in his hands. The gallery buzzed audibly until the judge rapped his gavel. Outside the court, Purbright found Miss Dainty shaken. "I never thought my typing would bring me to this," she said faintly. "You may find," Purbright replied, "that words on paper weigh heavier than stones. You have done what Venables intended. You have kept the truth alive." Her gratitude was timid, her fear more visible. Purbright knew well that Hallowes, if indeed implicated, would not relish such survival of evidence. By the trial's fourth day, the prosecution rested. The defence, with dogged persistence, attempted to portray Venables as unstable, his enemies imagined rather than real. But their arguments faltered against the tangible ink of the letters. When the judge adjourned, murmurs in the town already pronounced verdicts. But Purbright's mind was elsewhere. He had received word from Malley. Hallowes had arranged a clandestine meeting at a warehouse on the canal. "Tonight?" Purbright asked. "Tonight, sir. 11 o'clock. He'll not be alone." The inspector tapped out his pipe. "Then we shall keep him company." The canal at night carried an air of forgotten industry. Rusting cranes and derelict sheds loomed as shadows, their silence broken only by the slap of water. Purbright, with Malley and Love, concealed themselves near the appointed warehouse. Presently a carriage arrived, its lamps dimmed. Hallowes alighted heavily, his bulk unmistakable even in darkness. He was joined by two men who carried bundles. They vanished inside. Purbright motioned his sergeants forward. They advanced, silently, pushing open the creaking door. Inside, a lantern revealed the men hurriedly feeding papers into a brazier. Flames licked upward, illuminating Hallows's florid face as he muttered instructions. "Good evening, Alderman," Purbright's voice cut across the hiss of burning. Hallows spun, his eyes wide. "Inspector, what is this intrusion?" Purbright stepped closer, calm. "A rescue, sir. Those documents appear to be of municipal interest. We cannot allow their cremation without the ratepayers' consent." Hallows blustered. "Mere rubbish! Old minutes, nothing more?" "Indeed." Purbright's hand gestured, and Love swiftly seized a half-burned sheet from the brazier, smothering it underfoot. The faintly legible words spoke of payments, contractors, and signatures, one unmistakably Hallows's own. The alderman's face purpled. "You have no right—" "No right," Purbright agreed mildly, "save that of the law." Malley stepped forward with cuffs. Hallows did not resist, only sagged into resignation, his shoulders heavy. At dawn the next morning, the town received its second sensation in a week. Alderman Hallows arrested in document-burning plot. The Chronicle printed an extra edition, its presses groaning with delight. In the court, the revelation sent ripples of astonishment. Havelock's expression betrayed both shock and rage. Pybus appeared relieved, as though betrayal confirmed his long-held suspicions. Purbright, once again at the rear, watched silently. Justice was never a tidy affair. It sprawled, unexpected, dragging in more than intended. But in Hallows's downfall, he sensed the shape of completion forming. Yet he also knew the trial was not done, nor would it end with a single verdict. For Flaxborough itself was on trial, its institutions, its complacency, its habit of wrapping corruption in civic ceremony. That evening, Purbright walked the high street. Shopkeepers drew shutters, lamps flickered, and the rain polished cobbles into gleam. He paused outside the Chronicle office, where Bristow's latest edition was displayed. The headline, predictably enormous, screamed, "Venables avenged?" The inspector smiled faintly at the question mark. Bristow's punctuation had once again sought refuge in ambiguity. He turned away, his pipe glowing like a solitary beacon. Behind him the town murmured and speculated, feasting on scandal as though it were sustenance. Ahead lay the trial's conclusion, the jury's solemn nod, and beyond that perhaps, a quieter reckoning. For though Venables had been silenced, his papers, his allies, and even his stubborn righteousness had endured. In their endurance they had forced a borough to confront itself. And Purbright, walking steadily beneath the rain, knew the story had nearly reached its end, but not quite. One more chapter remained, the last curtain where truth and consequence must finally meet. The trial of councillors, Havelock and Pybus resumed with new urgency, for the arrest of Alderman Hallows had altered its complexion. Where once the defence had painted Venables as delusional, they now found themselves scrambling against fresh evidence of conspiracy and cover-up. The courtroom was a furnace of anticipation. Men who would normally sit contentedly in their barber's chair for gossip now stood in the gallery with their collars unbuttoned, eager for every syllable. Women who rarely troubled themselves with municipal affairs whispered like choristers, their shawls drawn close as if to catch the scandal before it escaped. Hallows, though not yet arraigned, was called as a witness. He entered with the gait of a condemned man and the face of one already sentenced. His attempt at bluff dignity faltered the moment he took the oath. The Crown's barrister wasted no courtesy. "Alderman, were you not, as treasurer of the borough, responsible for the dispersal of funds to contractors whose services were, shall we say, of doubtful necessity?" Hallows's lips trembled. "It is not uncommon for councils to approve—" "Answer the question, sir," the judge interposed. Hallows stammered, "Yes." The gallery gasped. One confession, though narrow, set the tone. Each subsequent inquiry drew forth either reluctant admissions or blustering denials so transparent that laughter threatened to erupt among the spectators. At last, when confronted with the half-burned sheet retrieved from the brazier, Hallowes bowed his head. "I was persuaded," he muttered, "that silence was expedient." For Havelock and Pybus, this betrayal was terminal. Their faces told the jury all that remained to be known, guilt shared, now disowned. Outside the courthouse, the town reeled in satisfaction. "We always knew," said Mrs. Virtue to her companions in the bakery queue, "that nothing good came of aldermen who wear spats." By the week's end, the jury returned its verdict. Havelock and Pybus were found guilty of conspiracy to murder Councillor Venables. The sentence, imprisonment for life, was delivered with solemnity. Havelock bore it like a man clinging to a plank, grim and silent. Pybus wept openly, his hands covering his face. Hallowes's trial was scheduled for the autumn, but few doubted its result. Purbright, standing in the hushed court, experienced not triumph, but a quiet weariness. Justice, when it came, did not ring with trumpets. It creaked forward like an old wagon, burdened with both truth and compromise. And the following day, Miss Clara Green placed flowers at the grave of Councillor Venables. She lingered there, the November wind tugging at her coat. Purbright, passing through the churchyard on some other errand, paused respectfully. "You have given him peace," he said gently. She turned, surprised but comforted. "I thought perhaps no one would remember him kindly." "He was not always easy, Inspector." "Few reformers are. But he troubled the right people, and that, Miss Green, is sometimes the highest form of service." Her smile was faint. "And what becomes of Flaxborough now?" Purbright glanced across the gravestones to where the town's rooftops clustered beneath a lowering sky. "It will gossip, make resolutions, elect fresh aldermen, and within a season or two be much the same as before. The world does not improve by verdicts alone, but it remembers in its own untidy fashion." Back at the police station, Sergeant Malley entered with the latest issue of the Chronicle. "Look at this, sir," he said with undisguised glee. The headline declared, "Council scandals swept away, clean broom for borough." Purbright scanned the article, penned in Bristow's usual Baroque style, heavy with adjectives and light on fact. "A clean broom, Malley, may be used to sweep dirt under a carpet. We shall see." Love, ever earnest, asked, "Do you think it will happen again, sir?" Another lot carrying on the same way. Purbright tamped his pipe thoughtfully. "Human nature, love, has a knack for repetition. It is the only true recycling scheme that never falters." For a fortnight, Flaxborough basked in the glow of moral rectitude. Committees met, resolutions were passed, and speeches were made praising the vigilance of the law. Yet already hints of new intrigues stirred. A curious contract for municipal lighting, a whispered partnership between a councillor's nephew and a builder of uncertain solvency. Purbright, noting these developments in the margin of his reports, felt no surprise. "The tide goes out," he murmured, "and then it returns." Still, there was satisfaction in knowing that Venables' death had not been entirely in vain. His voice, extinguished by fear, had nevertheless been heard again, through paper, through testimony, and through the stubborn persistence of truth. One evening, Purbright dined quietly at the King's Arms. Around him, the townsfolk debated the trial with gusto. Some praised the police, others condemned the council, still others speculated which publican had supplied the whisky consumed during illicit meetings. Purbright listened without comment. At length, the landlord approached. "Inspector, would you care for another pint?" "No, thank you," Purbright said with his customary mildness. "1 is company, 2 are argument, 3 are public office." The landlord chuckled. "You'll not be standing for counsel, then?" Purbright's eyes twinkled. "I fear I lack the essential qualification." "What's that?" "A tolerance for dishonour, so long as it wears the right tie." And so Flaxborough returned to its routines. The high street bustled, the church bells tolled, the gossip warmed every parlour. But beneath the surface lay the faint recognition that the borough had glimpsed its own reflection in an unflattering mirror. Purbright, walking home along the river, paused upon the bridge. The water glided darkly beneath, carrying with it the refuse of mills and households alike. Yet now and then, amidst the murk, a gleam of reflected light flickered. So it was, he reflected, with human affairs, muddied, imperfect, yet occasionally touched with brightness enough to be called justice. He lit his pipe, the flames small but steady in the night air,